So this is getting started. Today's objective, I need to move this guy out of my way. Today's objective is to understand what trauma is and that you're not stuck in it. And this is so important because nobody gets out of this life without some trauma. It's a natural process based on our biology, and moving out of it is also a natural process. Everyone has had experiences that have overwhelmed their ability to cope, but we can go back to those experiences with a sense of our own resilience and power and learn how to process and let go of that trauma. To simply begin to see that we're not bad or crazy is a gigantic step towards recovery. To begin to recognize how this can remain in our bodies after the danger has passed. And that is the first step to realizing that we're not bad or crazy. It was a huge day for me when I realized that I had never felt safe as a child and that my nervous system was just lit up. But then the realization spread to understanding that beyond physical states, we also pick up unconscious patterns of emotions and beliefs that are based in those overwhelming, unprocessed experiences. The fact is that most of our behavior is unconsciously driven, but we think we're in complete control of our decisions. We're not. My favorite fantasy book title for my autobiography was I Rationalize, Therefore I Am. And it came out of watching my family and others behave badly, but always finding a rationale that satisfied them, if not anybody else. I studied at the foot of the master. The cognitive mind does not seem to be as geared towards healing the rift in our psyche as protecting it. So when we can recognize that we're feeling afraid, hopeless, helpless, or trapped, and stay with that feeling and name it and listen to it, we can start to mediate the experience like a good parent. These overwhelming feelings are like an overly conscientious telegram boy who isn't going to leave you alone until you open the telegram and read it. When I started to realize that I had never felt safe as a child and much of my maladaptive behavior was in the nervous system, I started to experience myself as a scared child and not as a misbehaving adult. This allowed me to examine what my real needs were and to attend to them. When we ignore the needs of the unconscious body, it has a way of misbehaving to get our attention. And finally, and most importantly, get some ideas on how you would like to move forward on your path to healing. This is the primary objective. Everyone is different. Each of us has different goals, different talents, and limitations. Moving out of trauma is a process of self-exploration and discovery. Each and every one of you has latent resources within yourself that you've never recognized. And I think you're going to find that this is about personal growth and learning to love yourself, warts and all. And the natural byproduct of loving and accepting yourself is loving and accepting others. So, but first, a few definitions. Here's a big one. What is trauma? Trauma is an experience that leaves an indelible impression on the body and mind that the danger has not passed. Traumatic experiences leave us in a state of alert so that anything that reminds us of the experience sends us back in time. And we're responding again with the same brain space that we had at the time. Trauma overwhelms our nervous system and our resources for self-empowerment. Trauma overwhelms our ability to process and integrate our experience. We just don't have the internal resources to respond, whether we're 2 years old or 52 years old. So a 2-year-old trapped on a locked balcony is going to be traumatized, whereas a 52-year-old is not. Trauma is not rare. 1 in 5 have been molested, 1 in 4 have been hit or beaten or grew up with an alcoholic relative, 1 in 8 have witnessed their mothers being beaten. In fact, according to the National Council for Behavioral Health, 70% of Americans in the US have experienced some form of trauma. Bullying, medical trauma, disasters, physical abuse, complex trauma, community violence, refugee trauma, sexual abuse, sex trafficking, terrorism and violence, early childhood trauma, intimate partner violence, and traumatic grief. Trauma disconnects us from our sense of self, our ability to perceive and process our experiences, and to respond accordingly. But we can find these latent resources within ourselves and learn to process the experience so it no longer overwhelms us. So when I say that we're disconnected from ourselves, what do I mean about connecting with ourselves? Connection is a feedback loop of receiving and sending information. It's a conversation that's not always about words. So I send to you, you receive it, process it, integrate it, and then you put your own spin on it and send it back. Then I receive, process, and integrate it, take it within my needs, wants, and desires, and then I send it back to you. Connection is feeling the pain of stubbing our toe and saying, ouch. It's buying a ticket to a movie. It's hugging your child. It's laughing at a joke. It's honking your horn at somebody who just cut you off. It's a conversation that is not always about words. Sending is any physical, emotional, or cognitive self-expression. So sending is talking, singing, sticking out your tongue, kicking a ball, playing the piano, writing poetry. It's any movement. Sending also is the emotional content of speech, which is sometimes inconsistent with the words. And so that's where you get sarcasm. Yeah, right. And that's different than, yeah, right. Receiving is an opening to our experience that has no agenda. It's listening, feeling, seeing, mirroring, accepting, understanding, paying attention. It's pure perception. You're receiving this workshop right now. And when we perceive that someone is upset, listen to a concert, or feel our own hunger pangs, we're receiving. So when one side isn't receiving or sending, the connection is broken. And when our needs, feelings, opinions, beliefs are not received, our ability to express ourselves is wounded. It's like not going to a child's recital or responding to a question or a concern. When someone has power over you and forces you to do something you don't want to do, sometimes people have to just give up sending. But we also give up receiving sometimes. And people who are extremely controlling are not receiving the needs of others. They manipulate and otherwise force others to do their own wishes without regard to their needs. It turns out that emotional connection is an innate dependency need in all mammals. And we're going to talk about this more in the module on limbic resonance. But for now, just note that half of all children under the age of 2 that lose their primary caregiver and don't find a loving replacement die. We physically need to be loved. And trauma wounds are receivers and our transmitters. When we're in flashback, we aren't receiving or responding to our current experience, but a past one. When I was in a 12-step program for families of alcoholics, I realized in the first year that everybody on both sides of the program, alcoholics and codependents alike, had a control disorder. They were trying to control things that they either had no control over or they had given up control over something they should have control over. But they also had relationship trauma, and I wondered what the connection was, and here it is. When we stop receiving others, we're only sending, and that is control. So it's all because our receivers are wounded. Stage fright is about a wounded transmitter. So trauma disconnects us from ourselves. Mentally, trauma cuts us off from our talents and abilities and disrupts our ability to learn. Emotionally, we can't respond to our current experience because we are reacting to a past one. Physically, we can't read the true needs of our bodies because our sensations are either overwhelming or they're numbed out. And spiritually, trauma affects our ability to connect with others, with ourselves, and with the world around us. We can't determine our true needs and wants or know how to meet them. In order to truly heal trauma, we have to address all of these wounds. So, what is awareness? This is the model for the three-tiered brain. It was developed by Paul MacLean, and it's criticized for being too simplistic. And in fact, some people would tell you it's been thoroughly debunked, but we still use it anyway. A statistician by the name of George Box at the University of Wisconsin said, all models are wrong, some are useful. So here is yet another wrong, but extremely useful model of the structure and functions of the brain. The basic idea is that we have this hierarchical structure in the brain that evolved as our functioning evolved. Each brain has a different way of processing information. So the first part to evolve, can you see my little clicker here? Is the lizard brain in yellow, and that is responsible for sensory motor processing, survival instincts. Oh, come back. There we go. Survival instincts, movement and involuntary bodily functions like your hormones and digestion, respiration, and the like. The next in the evolutionary model came the limbic or the mammal brain, which is responsible for emotional processing. And it introduced mothering, play, dreaming, and all of the emotions like love, fear, disgust, shame, and the like. And then finally, you have the neocortex up here in purple, and that's responsible for cognitive processing, symbolic language, reasoning, conscious awareness, and motor control. So these brains interact, but trauma can disrupt that interaction. Healing from trauma includes reestablishing healthy links between these processors. And one primary difference between these brains is that they each speak a different language. The language of the neocortex is verbal symbolic language. The language of the limbic brain is emotion, and the language of the lizard brain is sensation and movement. So you cannot tell someone who is hysterical to calm down and have that be helpful at all. You can't tell someone who's terrified that they aren't really in danger. That is what somatic methods do. They speak the right language. So there are two ways that these brains interact in processing information in this model. And one that starts from the lizard brain and our automatic processing, and that's called bottom up. The other starts with our thinking decision-making processes, and that's called top down. So bottom up processing is unconscious behavior. It's dominated by the lizard and the limbic brains, and infants and young children are guided primarily by sensory motor and emotional processing. And this includes the factory installed actions like swallowing, kicking, blinking, breathing, and crying. But it also includes what we learn later, like eating, crawling, reaching, and walking, that are learned after we're born. Cognitive processing doesn't start to come online until the end of the second year. When we're young, we use our emotional processor to make decisions based on like, dislike, fear, love, etc. And we still do that as adults too. That does not disappear. Children develop a vocabulary of patterns of movement and emotions during the formative years that they carry into adulthood. In addition to the motor development is emotional development, like how we react to disappointment or excitement or success. We pick up our belief systems when we're little. We learn what's safe and what's dangerous. We learn how to show love, or even how we deal with fear. And that's what we've been seeing in the last couple of years. Some people react to fear by hiding, some get angry, some try to take advantage of the situation, and some are running towards danger to help. All of these behaviors are learned when we're very young. Top-down processing is dominated by cognitive processing in the neocortex. And I mentioned earlier that this doesn't come online until the end of the second year. And this is why infants and young children are bottom up. This processing requires thinking, executive functioning, the will, and conscious motor control. Other examples are learning to read and write, driving a car, learning a second language, how to play an instrument, dancing, swimming, sports, and that kind of thing. But when top-down actions occur many, many, many times, they become automatic and we no longer require cognitive functions. So top-down, after many repetitions, becomes bottom-up. So think about how you had to be so aware of everything you did when you were first learning how to drive a car. And now you can almost literally do it in your sleep. And I practically drove home from Seattle one night asleep. There was no cognitive functioning going on. So this is what we mean by unconscious behavior. It's a pattern in the brain between these three brains that is fired so many times, we don't have to think about it anymore. It's an automatic response. Trauma lives in the unconscious. It is unconscious, bottom-up processing. Until I met Leah, I thought that the childhood trauma that I had suffered from started after my father's open heart surgery when he started drinking and raging. And I now understand that this very likely was medical trauma. And I have many very fragmented memories, explicit memories of that. But when I started seeing Leah, it turned out that my childhood trauma actually had begun as an infant with narcissistic, traumatized parents. And the memories were, here are the memories: anxiety, depression, overwhelm, rage, toxic shame, hysteria, but also very dry skin, chronic bronchitis, and an eating disorder. Somatic methods allow us to communicate with the unconscious lower brains and get their story. So for any of you who have been a 12-step program, this quote should be very familiar. The definition of anxiety is of insanity, is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. This is a quote from Albert Einstein, a very smart guy. After I started studying how the brain learns, I realized it's not insanity, it's bottom-up processing. We've stopped thinking. Awareness is key to recovery from trauma. We want to bring the unconscious to consciousness so we can process and integrate the experience with the awareness of our new abilities and resources. That is what this series of workshops is designed to help you accomplish. But it's also imperative we do this slowly. So I wanted to give you an awareness through movement lesson, and I wanted to talk about how awareness through movement is one of the things that we can use to bring about this somatic awareness that can help us process trauma. So awareness through movement lessons are movement lessons that I give you instructions on how to move, and you take your attention within and listen and do the movement as best you can. It takes us out of our thinking, judging selves. And this is what I mean by the healing brain space of the baby. We've learned how to interpret our experiences, and those interpretations may not be accurate or life-affirming. Movement lessons start to reform our experience from the body up. It increases our kinesthetic or felt sense of ourselves. Our body is our first container. Trauma can scare us out of our true home. The place we should always be able to come back to feel safe is our bodies. Awareness through movement increases our movement vocabulary in the same way a baby learns to walk in the first year of life. Trauma can freeze movement. These lessons will start gently coaxing away from that freeze. It decreases unnecessary tension held in the body. Everyone holds tension in their bodies in their favorite places, and that freezes movement too. Frozen movement makes other places have to work harder, and then that is where you have pain. And that's why chronic pain and dysfunction is a symptom or a result of trauma. It helps make us aware of our habits that are not serving us well, and it gives us new options. And it's all about the awareness of the movement and not the movement itself. Sometimes just becoming aware causes an immediate shift that improves our sense of free movement. It teaches us how to stay present with our sensations and needs. And I know from this from experience, and I have a story to tell you about later. And then all of this has a surprising impact on our sense of safety and well-being. And it shouldn't be a surprise, because movement is empowerment. And at the core of trauma is a loss of our sense of power. So in ATM, awareness through movement, we connect with ourselves. It's a practice of listening and responding to our physical self. The student is instructed to stop and rest whenever they need to. The student follows verbal instructions the best they can, always staying within a comfortable and easy range of movement. The student does not put on the teacher's body. And you'll be instructed not to go as far as you can go right away, to stay within your comfortable range. And you cannot do it wrong unless you hurt yourself. And all the students in my ATM classes know about the stories I've told where I have hurt myself in the first 2 years of training, because this was a very difficult lesson for me to learn. And there was my favorite one is where I partially dislocated a rib, because a position was very uncomfortable, and I tried to do it anyway. And I stayed in that position for 15 minutes and partially dislocated a rib. So this is a hard lesson to learn.